Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Journey into Marvel. My name is Josh, and this podcast is all about my probably ridiculous attempt to read through all of Marvel's main universe comics. Now, I haven't been a comic book nerd for very long, so despite knowing about the main characters like Captain America, Iron Man, and Spider-Man, my first real introduction to Marvel and their crazy interconnected universe was in 2008 with the debut of the first Iron Man movie and the launch of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. After watching a few more years' worth of movies, I started to seriously consider getting into comics. But I had absolutely no idea where to start. I read the first Civil War arc in anticipation of the third Captain America film, but I was honestly pretty lost with all the characters that I knew nothing about. Jump ahead to about a year ago, and I discovered Marvel Unlimited, which is Marvel's online warehouse of pretty much everything they've ever published. I downloaded the app, signed up for the subscription, and decided to dive in head first. I started with the first few issues of Daredevil from the 1960s because of the new Netflix series, and I think in the second issue, Electro, who is a Spider-Man villain, tries to take over the Baxter Building, which is the headquarters of the Fantastic Four. This made me want to read about Electro's origins, the Fantastic Four, and everything else. I ended up finding an awesome reading order online, and I made the insane decision to just read everything. Alright, to start with, I want to give you guys a couple disclaimers. I'm only reading through Marvel's main 616 universe, starting in 1961 with Fantastic Four number 1. I read through a few of the older Golden Age comics like Captain America, the original Human Torch, and Submariner, and I didn't really like them, so I won't be talking about those. I'm also not including the Ultimate Universe in this podcast, although I do really enjoy Ultimate Spider-Man and Ultimate X-Men. Second, I'm reading through the comics in an order that's built for maximum readability, which doesn't necessarily line up one-to-one with publication order. The order I'm using can be found at cmro.travis-starnes.com. That's cmro.travis-starnes.com. These guys are seriously dedicated to making a great reading order while constantly expanding and revising it. It's a great website with an awesome community, and I would highly recommend it if you guys want to check them out. The last little announcement that I want to make is that I've already been reading these comics for about a year. That means that this first episode will be an extremely brief overview of the first 900 comics in the reading order, which were published from late 1961 to late 1968. This means I won't be going into great detail on specific issues. Instead, I'm going to go through each series as a whole and talk a little bit about what I liked and didn't like about each. I know that doesn't possibly do them justice because there is just so much great material there, but the subsequent episodes will go into much greater detail on a smaller number of issues. Alright, with all that said, let's jump into the good stuff. In the early 1960s, Marvel didn't have the overwhelming stable of characters that they do now, so early on in my reading, I encountered a lot of the Fantastic Four. Like many non-comic readers, my only experience with Mr. Fantastic, Human Torch, the Invisible Girl, and The Thing was through film, which made me a little apprehensive judging from the ridiculously mediocre big screen offerings. However, my fears completely vanished when I actually read some early issues. Sure, most issues were a little corny, but that's something I was expecting and actually looking forward to while reading these early Marvel books. Stan Lee's storytelling is superb, starting off the Marvel staple of having flawed heroes who deal with real-world problems. Jack Kirby's art is detailed with an instantly recognizable style that's all his own, although the farther along I read, it started to get a little old. I felt like everyone else's art was moving along, but old King Kirby's was just treading water. The Fantastic Four series also introduced many of Marvel's greatest heroes and villains, such as the Inhumans, Silver Surfer, Black Panther, Galactus, and of course, Doctor Doom. I only have a few minor gripes with the Fantastic Four, as overall it's an excellent series. One thing that plagued many 1960s Marvel books was the over-reliance on communist villains. This was important for the time as it showed how America's might could overcome the Reds, but it just hasn't aged well at all. Also, Marvel started adding solo Human Torch stories to Strange Tales in an attempt to boost sales of their sci-fi anthology book. For the most part, these were not good. I like the Human Torch as a character, but it seems like he's not enough to carry a story by himself. They later try to inject a little more variety by adding the Thing to the mix, but even his gruff charm couldn't save those stories. Despite these small shortcomings, I have been really enjoying the first 80-ish issues of Fantastic Four, and I look forward to it every time it comes up in the order. Actually, the 900th comic in the order, and the last one I read, is Fantastic Four Annual Number 6, which culminates in the birth of Franklin Richards, son of Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Girl. One common thread with many of these superheroes is that they got their start in one of Marvel's anthology books. It would take years before the likes of Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, and many others would get their own solo gig. The first of these that I want to talk about is Ant-Man. His alter ego Henry Pym made his debut in January of 1962 in an issue of Tales to Astonish. Initially, it seems like a run-of-the-mill sci-fi story where a scientist shrinks down to insect size and has to deal with the ensuing chaos. Hank Pym would be reintroduced as Ant-Man in September of the same year and in the same book. I loved these stories as Stan had to come up with creative ways to utilize a tiny superhero to solve large-scale problems. The introduction of Janet Van Dyne as the Wasp only helped to give these stories another layer of depth. Once Hank took on the persona of Giant Man in November 1963, I started to lose interest. Sure, his charm and wit were still intact, but I felt that being giant gave the character a little too much power over the situation, and it lost that sense of danger that Ant-Man had. Giant Man would eventually be replaced with features starring Namor the Submariner in August of 1965. Giant Man and the Wasp were reintroduced into the Avengers in May of 1966, although this time Hank took the name Goliath. One character I was beyond excited to read about was Iron Man. Tony Stark was introduced in March of 1963 in issue 39 of Tales of Suspense, which is another anthology book. In his first few appearances, including the first issue of Avengers, he wore a suit of bulky golden armor. This would later be slimmed down to his iconic red and gold suit that has kept the same general appearance to this day. Many of the Iron Man stories so far follow the same general pattern. The bad guy gets close to defeating him, Tony Stark almost dies from not having enough charge in his chest piece. Somehow, he manages to pull through by charging his suit or through sheer willpower and defeat the villain. This same pattern over and over again quickly wore itself thin. So far, Iron Man's rogues gallery has only a few duds. Villains like the Melter, the Crusher, and the Unicorn are forgettable. Highlights include Titanium Man, the Freak, who is really a mutated Happy Hogan, and of course, the Mandarin. Iron Man would finally get his own solo book in May of 1968. I've only read 6 issues of it, but the stories really benefit from the longer 20-page length instead of the 10 or 12-page length in Tales of Suspense. The villains have a longer time to develop their personalities, and they don't seem to rely too much on the formula I talked about earlier. Also, they reintroduced Happy Hogan and Pepper Potts, 2 of my favorite characters who are out of the picture for quite a few issues. One thing I will miss about the Tales of Suspense days is Gene Colan's artwork. Gene Colan has been my favorite artist so far, so I imagine I'll talk a lot more about him at some point. Iron Man stories have been decent for the most part, and quite good when they're not following the same formula. I'm definitely looking forward to reading more about this iconic Marvel hero. The Incredible Hulk, surprisingly enough, did not get his start in an anthology book. He had a short 6-issue solo run before he became the second feature in Tales to Astonish. Surprisingly, Hulk did not debut with his iconic green color. Originally, he was gray and transformed with the rising and setting of the sun. Weird, right? This was quickly changed to the green rage monster we are all familiar with. The Hulk is an interesting character. He never wants to be in the situations he finds himself in. He only ever wants peace and quiet, but humanity, especially General Thunderbolt Ross, can never seem to leave him alone. It almost makes you feel bad for the big guy. Hulk's stories have been entertaining because they are so different than the normal good versus evil superhero stories. Early on, it seemed like Marvel didn't really know what to do with the Hulk, but they definitely found his footing. Hulk has seen some really cool adventures, my favorite of which saw him causing chaos in Asgard after being transported there by Loki. In April of 1968, Hulk's solo book was finally revived. I've only read a few of these, but so far they're much better than the 6 original books, with more intricate plots and far better artwork. One of the only things I dislike about the Hulk stories is that classic Marvel love triangle. Both Bruce Banner and Major Talbot are in love with Betty Ross, who also loves Bruce Banner, although he doesn't believe they should be together because of his tendency to turn into the Jolly Green Giant. Marvel used this basic plot point quite a bit early on. Iron Man had Pepper Potts, Thor had Jane Foster, Daredevil had Karen Page, Captain America had Sharon Carter, Spider-Man had at least 25 love interests, and even Doctor Strange had a couple ladies. Alright, I kind of went off on a bit of a tangent there, but you get the idea. When many people think of Marvel Comics, they think of Spider-Man. Spider-Man has long been one of the most popular superheroes throughout comics, television, and movies. He first appeared in Amazing Fantasy number 15 in August 1962. Although this would end up being the final issue of Amazing Fantasy in the 1960s, Spider-Man's popularity was strong enough to net him his own solo series in early 1963. I'm 65 issues into Amazing Spider-Man, and, so far, it's the most consistently solid book. The artwork, from Steve Ditko's early stuff all the way to the classic team-up of John Romita and Jim Mooney, has been awesome. And Stan really found his groove with writing these stories. I even found myself caring a lot about the side characters, like Aunt May, Mary Jane Watson, J. Jonah Jameson, and Gwen Stacy. Spidey's witty attitude while fighting also continues to be a signature aspect of his character, even to this day. Spider-Man's foes are certifiably classic: Green Goblin, Kraven the Hunter, Electro, Mysterio, Rhino, Vulture, Lizard, Scorpion, Dr. Octopus. Wow, I am just now noticing that there are a lot of animal-themed villains. The only criticism that I have with these early Spidey comics is the Enforcers. I hate the Enforcers. They're a villain team made up of the three dumbest characters ever: Fancy Dan, Montana, and especially Ox. Maybe it's a little unfair for a powerful superhero to beat up three regular, although pretty skilled people, but they deserve every beating they get. I encourage you to check out Amazing Spider-Man number 10 to see what I mean. One Spider-Man story that stood out to me was actually a spin-off book called The Spectacular Spider-Man. This issue dealt with slightly more serious themes and was presented in a slick, black and white noir style that really showed off the shading skills of the artists. Spider-Man continues to be one of my favorite superheroes, and his books really show off the impressive talent that Marvel had during the 1960s. Next in Marvel's cast of heroes is the mighty Thor. I really enjoyed the Thor movies, so I was pretty excited to see the comic version of this character, and, for the most part, I was not disappointed. Thor was introduced in the anthology book Journey into Mystery in August 1962. This book also inspired the name of this podcast. The Thor comics are different than anything else I've read, because they're attempting to adapt an existing Earth mythology into superhero comics. Besides Thor, many Norse gods are featured, with Odin and Loki being the most prominent. Even Hercules and other Greek deities also make an appearance. Thor starts off this series as the lame human doctor Donald Blake. He finds Thor's hammer and, being worthy, can transform into Thor by tapping it on the ground. Later, we find out that Thor was exiled to Earth to live his life as a mortal in order to be humbled in the eyes of his father, Odin. Thor battles his way through many enemies, like the Enchantress, the Executioner, and Ego the Living Planet, though none are as memorable as his own brother, Loki. March of 1966 would see the release of Thor's solo book. Unlike some of the others on this list, there wasn't a whole lot of differences between these stories and those in Journey into Mystery. They kept the same tone, similar artwork, and the quality was comparable. One excellent addition to many of the Thor books is a set of short flashback stories titled Tales of Asgard. These depict adventures that Thor had before he was cast down to Earth, and they're entertaining for the most part, although I wish they would have just been 1 or 2 pages longer. So far, the Thor comics have been kind of right in the middle, with some arcs being excellent and others being just so-so. That being said, I'm still looking forward to reading more about this awesome superhero. The next hero I want to talk about is quite a bit different than the other heroes of the time. By bringing in mysticism and black magic into the mix, Steve Ditko and Stan Lee were able to differentiate from the more sci-fi or fantasy-based heroes of the time. Dr. Stephen Strange debuted in the aptly named Strange Tales in July 1963. Although his debut comic was only 5 pages long, it was vastly better than the awful Human Torch story it shared the book with. Side note, Paste Pot Pete is hands down the worst villain of all time. Just had to get that out there. For the most part, the Doctor Strange stories have been pretty awesome, especially Steve Ditko's crazy interdimensional artwork. Sometimes I found myself just staring at a page for a while, just to take it all in. Another side note, the recent Doctor Strange movie really nailed the classic Ditko vibe with its special effects. The only times I found myself not getting into a Doctor Strange comic were any time Baron Mordo showed up. I know he's Strange's most famous adversary, but his appearances all felt the same. He would show up, somehow subdue the Ancient One and Doctor Strange, claim to be more powerful than ever before, and then get beaten again. Sometimes there would even be another, more interesting villain, but we would find out that he was being controlled by, or actually was, Baron Mordo yet again. However, there were great villains, like Dormammu, and it was always a treat to see a hint of the larger Marvel cosmology when an entity like Eternity or the Living Tribunal would show up. Doctor Strange would move on to a full-length book in June 1968. I've read maybe 5 or 6 of these so far, and they utilize the character very well. If I had to nitpick, I would say that I am not really a fan of the romantic aspects of the book, but it's not overwhelming and makes perfect sense with the narrative. I would say that Doctor Strange is somewhere in my top 5 favorite series so far. When it comes to pure popularity, the X-Men are one of Marvel's most famous teams. Their story of a society that is unwilling to accept mutants has resonated with multiple generations of kids, teens, and adults who feel like they are different or don't belong. However, I was unprepared for just how ridiculous and cheesy the early X-Men issues really are. Starting in September of 1963, the X-Men series told the tale of a team of good mutants struggling to save the world from the plots of evil mutants. The original team consisted of Cyclops, Marvel Girl, Beast, Angel, and Iceman, all led by Professor X. Now, conceptually, this sounds like a great premise. Although in reality, it seems like Stan and Jack struggled on the execution. I'm looking back through old issues right now, and honestly, the only ones that jump out at me as memorable involve Magneto and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, or the Sentinels. You know you're running out of ideas when you have your superheroes battling Frankenstein's monster. Ugh. Dwindling sales in 1969 would lead to the cancellation of X-Men with issue number 66. However, I'm only on issue 50-something, so I still have a few more of these stories to slog through. Also in September 1963, alongside the X-Men, Marvel released another series about a team of superheroes. That team was the Avengers, an alliance between Iron Man, Thor, Ant-Man, the Wasp, and the Hulk. This team, eventually replacing the Hulk with Captain America, would kick ass and take the names of multiple baddies, including Loki, Kang the Conqueror, Baron Zemo, and even the Hulk himself. However, in issue 16, the Avengers underwent a sudden lineup change, and this is where things can get a little confusing. All of the original Avengers departed, paving the way for a new team consisting of Captain America, Scarlet Witch, Quicksilver, and Hawkeye. More shakeups happened later, with Giant Man returning as Goliath, Hercules coming and going, Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver's departure, and Black Panther and Vision joining the team. That's a lot of information to take in, but where it stands now at issue number 58, the Avengers are Goliath, Wasp, Hawkeye, Black Panther, and Vision. Short of the occasional corny issue that's indicative of 1960s comics, I can't really find much to even nitpick with the Avengers. The storytelling, whether by Stan Lee or Roy Thomas, is superb, capturing how dramatic it can be having multiple superheroes under one roof, and it's always fun to see which new hero will join the team. It's a solid series that really shows how dedicated Marvel was to their huge shared universe, even in the early days. Like I mentioned before, Daredevil was the first series I attempted to read, and it served as my inspiration to try to read all of Marvel Comics. So this series is pretty important to me. You might know Daredevil as a dark and gritty, noir-themed affair, but not even the Man Without Fear was able to escape the delightful ridiculousness of 1960s comics. having a personality more like Spider-Man than the dark hero he would become. For his first few appearances, starting in April 1964, blind lawyer Matt Murdock would don a strange-looking yellow and dark red jumpsuit and fight crime as the hero Daredevil. Luckily, this outfit was changed to his classic one-color, dark red appearance in issue number 7, just in time for him to fight the Submariner. Speaking of his battles, Daredevil has his share of lame villains. The Owl, Leapfrog, the stupid Ox, the Matador, and the awful cringe-worthy team-up of Catman, Ape-Man, Birdman, and Frogman. On a better note, the good baddies seem to outweigh the bad so far. Daredevil battles the likes of Purple Man, Kazar, Doctor Doom, the Jester, and even Spider-Man and Thor at one point. Also, unpopular opinion time, I enjoy Stilt Man. Yes, the premise of a villain whose only power is hydraulic stilts is pretty lame. But it somehow works, and he ends up being one of Daredevil's best early enemies. The art by Gene Colan was also a huge highlight for me in this series. Alright, I can't possibly talk about early Daredevil and not mention the rad dude himself, Mike Murdock. For about 20 or so issues, Matt Murdock pretended to have a twin brother named Mike, who just so happened to be Daredevil. Even though they were never seen at the same time, everyone fell for it, even Matt's closest friends, Foggy Nelson and Karen Page. Matt ended up faking Mike's death and convinced everyone that he trained somebody else to be Daredevil in his place. I'm just so glad to be done with that storyline. Overall, the Daredevil series has been kind of all over the place, although there has been more good than bad. I really hope this series finds its footing soon. Alright, we're getting into the home stretch now, only about 5 more series to talk about. You might have noticed that I've only been discussing heroes from the 1960s, so I think it's time to go back a little farther. Captain America first appeared all the way back in March 1941, where he was seen punching Adolf Hitler right in his face. He was formally reintroduced in March 1964 in the Avengers number 4, and exactly 1 year later, a Captain America solo feature was added to Tales of Suspense, starting with issue number 59. Initially, it seemed like Stan and Jack weren't sure what to do with the newly revived character now that World War II was over. Cap ends up fighting mobsters and bank robbers more often than not. This got much better when they began setting the stories in the 1940s and using characters like Cap's Golden Age companion Bucky and classic villains like the Red Skull. Tales of Suspense would become a Captain America solo book with issue number 100. I've read about 8 or 9 of these, and I definitely feel that Marvel figured out the best way to handle this iconic hero. As a man without any special powers outside of peak physical condition and athleticism, Stan and Jack had to come up with more creative ways for Captain America to escape perilous situations. To me, comics are more interesting and fun if there is a sense of real danger, and that's exactly why I enjoy the Captain America series so much. Our next character debuted even before Captain America. The human Atlantean hybrid, Namor the Submariner, was created way back in April of 1939 and was a staple of Golden Age comics. For our consideration, Namor made his comeback in Fantastic Four number 4 in May 1962. He acted as an anti-hero or even villain more often than not, and was relegated to guest appearances until August 1965, where he would replace Giant Man in Tales to Astonish. In 1968, the Submariner would finally get his own solo book, which I was extremely excited for. The overall plot has enough twists and turns, even though it's a little repetitious, and the villains like Tiger Shark and Atuma are mostly interesting and well developed. There are a few too many rebellious military leaders in Atlantis, though. One of my only complaints about this series involves the Destiny storyline. Destiny was a villain who initially seemed important to Namor's overall story, and he spent multiple issues attempting to track him down. However, when he finally did find Destiny, the villain killed himself by jumping off of a building, making the whole affair seem like a giant waste of time. I know I've been saying this about most characters, but Namor has been one of my favorite heroes to read about so far. He takes that classic, brooding Marvel hero formula and perfects it. He's a complicated anti-hero who won't give up on his kingdom, even if they've renounced him as their leader for the 4th or 5th time. Plus, how hilarious is it that he can fly with those tiny little wings on his feet? One of the most polarizing characters for me is Nick Fury. He was introduced in May 1963 in Sergeant Fury and His Howling Commandos. Because this series is set during World War II and thus not part of the reading order, I decided to skip it. We'll go ahead and consider Nick Fury's first relevant appearance to be in Strange Tales number 135, finally replacing the mind-numbing Human Torch stories with the excellent Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. Colonel Fury has just been thrust into the position of director of the world's most advanced espionage team. Throughout most of this series, the S.H.I.E.L.D. team battles multiple rival groups seeking world domination, the most well-known of which are AIM and Hydra. These stories were excellent. They managed to blend a serious spy thriller with the campiness that other Marvel comics were known for. However, this changes towards the end of the Strange Tales run and through all of what I have read of the solo series. The stories become more focused on Fury rather than the whole team, and the plots become much more serious and harder to follow. I would often find myself bored by these stories, and really only reading them for the fantastic psychedelic art by Jim Steranko. While reading through some online comments, it seems that I am in the minority when it comes to not liking this new direction. Hopefully this series gets back to basics soon before I get too bored to continue. After many years of not introducing any new main superheroes, Stan Lee and Gene Colan created Captain Marvel for Marvel Superheroes number 12 in December 1967. The following May would see the release of Marvel's Spaceborne Superheroes solo book. Captain Marvel, or Captain Mar-Vell, is a Kree military leader who is tasked with observing the Earth and determining whether or not it's a threat to their galactic empire. Mar-Vell infiltrates a military base, takes on the human disguise of Dr. Walter Lawson, and allies himself with Earth against its many threats. He eventually hits a few roadblocks. The head of security at the military base, Carol Danvers, begins to suspect that he's an alien, and his Kree commanding officer, Jan Rog, constantly accuses him of treason. So far, Captain Marvel has battled the likes of Submariner and the Super Skrull, as well as some cool villains of his own, like the Metazoid. There hasn't been a dud yet in this series, but then again, I've only read about 6 or 8 issues. It's really unique to have a hero who doesn't know if he's going to have to destroy the world or not. This, along with the always great art of Gene Colan, makes Captain Marvel one of my favorite news stories. I really hope it retains its quality, as well as throwing a few curveballs in there to make things more interesting. Finally, we've come to the last series I want to talk about, Silver Surfer. He was actually around for quite a while before he got his own series, first appearing in Fantastic Four number 48. The Silver Surfer was the herald for the giant world-eating entity known as Galactus. Upon betraying his master to save the planet, he was exiled on Earth. He would continue to appear fairly often in Fantastic Four before the release of The Silver Surfer number 1 in August 1968. I've only read 4 issues out of this short 18-issue run, but so far they are excellent. They even run a little longer than the typical comic book, with 40 pages instead of 20. This gives the plot a lot longer to develop, and they don't have to resort to multiple issues to finish a story. The Surfer routinely saves the people of Earth from cosmic threats and gets no thanks, and often scorned for his troubles. Again, Marvel really enjoys writing brooding, tortured heroes. One major highlight of this series so far has been the introduction of Mephisto, who is basically the devil and an excellent villain. John Buscema's art, especially in the Mephisto issue, perfects the intricate blending of realism and fantasy. This series has been a joy to read so far, and you can really tell that this was a project near and dear to Stan Lee's heart. And with that, we have finally reached the end of this 900-issue catch-up episode of Journey into Marvel. As you could probably tell, this episode has been entirely scripted. Subsequent episodes will feature me talking, mostly unscripted, about 10 or so issues. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the end. I'm really excited to get this podcast going. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot me an email at metalsciencegeek@gmail.com. You've been awesome, and I'm going to go read some more comics.